In the final decades of the 15th century, Florence stood at the crossroads of Renaissance brilliance and political fragility. Governed, if unofficially, by the Medici family, the city pulsed with cultural vibrancy, even as social tension simmered beneath the surface. At the center of this tenuous balance was Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Il Magnifico, whose deft political maneuvering and generous patronage of the arts had cemented his position as Florence's uncrowned ruler. He surrounded himself with luminaries like Botticelli, Michelangelo, and Marsilio Ficino, projecting an image of Florence as a beacon of humanist progress. Yet behind the frescoed walls and philosophical dialogues, the city's oligarchic structures bred resentment, especially among those excluded from political power or concerned with the growing worldliness of the church. Lorenzo had built a system in which political loyalty was rewarded and dissent quietly neutralized. He held no official title, yet none in Florence could rival his influence. The Medici maintained control by managing elections, distributing patronage, and cultivating a web of supporters throughout the city's major institutions. However, his death in 1492 left a vacuum that would soon destabilize this delicate arrangement. His successor, Piero de' Medici, lacked both the charisma and strategic acuity of his father. Florence's political foundation, long dependent on the force of one man's personality, began to erode. Religious unease further aggravated the city's fragility. The wealth accumulated by banking families, including the Medici, and their open embrace of secular art and philosophy, had provoked concerns among conservative factions. Many Florentines, particularly the lower classes and devout middle strata, viewed the city's moral trajectory with alarm. The clergy, while often beneficiaries of Medici patronage, struggled with their own reputation for corruption and excess. Discontent simmered in convents and monasteries as well, many of which had become complacent centers of wealth, rather than austere centers of faith. One notable example of the spiritual malaise was the rise of mystic visions and popular cults centered on saints or Marian apparitions. These often reflected both a hunger for reform and a frustration with the perceived impiety of church leadership. Religious pageants, penitential processions, and flagellant groups grew in number, signaling that a significant portion of Florence's population yearned for a spiritual reckoning. It was in this context that a Dominican friar from Ferrara, previously mocked for his awkward sermons and obscure prophecies, would return to Florence and find an audience ready to listen. The Medici's weakening grip coincided with foreign pressures that strained Florence's stability. The Italian peninsula was a patchwork of rival city-states and foreign interests. France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire eyed its riches jealously, while the Papal States sought both temporal and spiritual dominance. In such a volatile environment, even minor shifts in allegiance or diplomacy could trigger chaos. The death of Lorenzo and the missteps of his son would soon expose Florence to such upheaval. Piero's foreign policy decisions further alienated key allies. When Charles VIII of France invaded Italy in 1494, Piero's hasty capitulation to the French monarch, surrendering Florentine fortresses without a fight, was widely viewed as cowardice, even treason. The Florentines, humiliated and incensed, expelled Piero from the city. The Medici regime, dominant for decades, collapsed overnight in a bloodless but decisive act of civic rebellion. Florence declared itself a republic once more, and into this power vacuum stepped a voice few had expected to lead the city, Girolamo Savonarola. What gave this Dominican preacher such sudden relevance was not merely the absence of the Medici, but the resonance of his long-ignored warnings. Years earlier, Savonarola had predicted divine punishment for Italy's sins and the rise of a new Cyrus, who would cleanse the church and purify the faithful. To many, the French king's arrival and the fall of the Medici seemed to fulfill his prophecy. His sermons, once seen as overly apocalyptic, were now interpreted as divinely inspired. Florence, rudderless and afraid, found in Savonarola a vessel for both its hopes and its guilt. But if Savonarola's ascent was meteoric, it was not without friction. Even as he won favor among reformist circles and popular assemblies, other Florentines regarded him with suspicion. Some elites resented his intrusion into political affairs. Clerics chafed at his denunciations of church corruption, while merchants and bankers fretted over his attacks on wealth and luxury. Moreover, his assertion that Florence had been chosen by God to become a new Jerusalem raised concerns that he intended to supplant traditional civic authority with theocratic rule. Despite these tensions, Savonarola's vision rapidly took root. He was instrumental in crafting a new republican constitution, modeled in part on older Florentine traditions, but infused with Christian ethics. He rejected the idea of strongman rule and insisted that moral renewal must accompany political reform. The city's councils, often swayed by his words, implemented laws against public immorality, gambling, and ostentatious dress. Florence began to look less like the vibrant capital of Renaissance indulgence and more like a penitential city-state under divine scrutiny. Beneath the surface of this transformation, however, a deeper current of anxiety festered. For some Florentines, the shift from artistic splendor to spiritual austerity felt like cultural self-mutilation. Taverns closed. Music was banned. Artists abandoned sensual themes for pious ones or ceased work altogether. A disturbing story circulated of a renowned sculptor who burned his own works in a fit of religious fervor, only to later collapse in despair and silence. Whether apocryphal or not, such tales reflected a city in psychological upheaval. What made this period especially tense was the uncertain balance between persuasion and coercion. While Savonarola did not personally wield military force, his supporters, especially among the youth, patrolled the streets, encouraging citizens to confess their sins and surrender luxury items. The moral climate grew increasingly claustrophobic, as if Florence were being reshaped not merely by law but by collective penance. It was no longer enough to obey, one had to believe. As the last vestiges of Medici power dissolved, and Florence reimagined itself under the watchful eye of a prophet, the city held its breath. The promise of moral regeneration stirred the hearts of many, but the cost was rising. Behind every prayer and fast lay the specter of public shaming, political purges, and increasingly spiritual absolutism. The Medici had ruled with influence and wealth. Savonarola would rule with fire and fear. Girolamo Savonarola was born in 1452 in the northern Italian city of Ferrara, into a modest but respected family of minor nobility. From a young age, he exhibited a deeply introspective temperament, prone to melancholic reflection, and fixated on themes of moral decay and divine justice. His early education at the University of Ferrara included philosophy and medicine, but the works that left the greatest impression were the writings of Thomas Aquinas and the lives of the early Christian saints. Disillusioned by the corruption he perceived within society, and tormented by his own spiritual inadequacies, Savonarola abruptly abandoned his studies at the age of 23 and entered the Dominican order at Bologna. Life in the convent provided Savonarola with the structured asceticism he craved. He immersed himself in scripture, theological study, and the strict disciplines of monastic life. Yet even among his peers, he was known for his obsessive piety. He fasted excessively, avoided worldly conversation, and cultivated an almost punishing silence. His letters from this period reflect an intense fear of damnation and a desperate longing for divine approval. It was during these years that he began to develop a theology steeped in apocalyptic urgency, believing that the end times were near and that Italy in particular had become a cesspool of vice deserving of divine wrath. Savonarola first arrived in Florence in 1482 to teach and preach at the convent of San Marco, itself a center of humanist scholarship, funded by Cosimo de' Medici. His early sermons, delivered in a stammering, unpolished voice, were met with indifference or even ridicule. While many Florentines preferred the eloquence of secular orators, Savonarola's rhetoric centered on the apocalypse punishment, and sin seemed more medieval than Renaissance. He was reassigned after only a few months, his superiors unsure whether he possessed the charisma necessary for public ministry. Yet Savonarola's exile was temporary. He returned in 1490, invited by the new prior of San Marco, who recognized his spiritual intensity and perhaps sensed Florence's shifting mood. This time Savonarola's sermons found more fertile ground. The city had grown weary of Medicean opulence, and the specter of ecclesiastical corruption weighed heavily on many consciences. Preaching from the pulpit of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, Savonarola began to captivate growing crowds. He adopted a style that was raw, unsparing, and vivid. He spoke of Florence as a modern Babylon, seduced by vanity and headed for destruction. He claimed to have received visions from God, including dreams of swords descending from heaven and cities consumed by flames. He warned of a coming scourge that would descend upon Italy unless the people repented. These prophecies, articulated with increasingly urgent passion, began to take on the character of divine revelation. Savonarola's sermons were carefully constructed to provoke not only fear but also self-examination. He singled out specific sins, greed, sexual licentiousness, and the buying of church offices. He decried women's fashions, the sale of indulgences, and the accumulation of wealth by clergy. He frequently compared Florence's elite to the Pharisees of the New Testament hypocrites who honored God with their lips but corrupted his law with their lives. His most biting condemnations were reserved for the Roman Curia, which he denounced as a brothel of Antichrist. One particularly disturbing feature of Savonarola's preaching was his tendency to describe in clinical detail the torments of hell. He would recount stories of sinners having their tongues torn out, their bodies flayed by demons, their entrails consumed by fire, all as a warning of what awaited those who remained unrepentant. In one infamous sermon, he described a woman who confessed to him her vanity and was struck dead within a week, her corpse so twisted and blackened that it could not be prepared for burial. Whether factual or invented, these stories cemented his reputation as a preacher of fearsome insight. It was not only his themes that drew attention, but his timing. In 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici died, leaving Florence politically and spiritually uncertain. Around the same time, Pope Innocent VIII also passed and was succeeded by Rodrigo Borgia Pope Alexander VI, whose reputation for vice and nepotism would soon become a scandal across Europe. The moral rot at the heart of Christendom was becoming too obvious to ignore, and Savonarola positioned himself as a prophet sent to awaken the faithful. His sermons took on the structure of a sustained campaign, each series building upon the last. He often spoke daily during Lent and Advent, using the liturgical calendar as a scaffolding for his theology. His pulpit became a platform not only for spiritual exhortation but also for civic reform. He advocated for the redistribution of wealth, the restructuring of government, and the purification of culture. More than a preacher, he was becoming a political actor, albeit one cloaked in monastic robes. Savonarola's popularity created a new faction in Florentine society, the Piagnoni, or Weepers. Comprised of men and women of all classes, these followers adopted his call for repentance with almost militant zeal. They held prayer meetings, sang hymns in the streets, and pressured their neighbors to abandon sinful behaviors. Children were encouraged to report the sins of their parents, and some accounts describe bands of youths going door to door collecting objects of vanity mirrors, perfumes, playing cards, even musical instruments to be destroyed in public bonfires. These purifying rituals were both symbolic and coercive. One obscure but telling account from this period involves a noblewoman who refused to surrender her expensive velvet gowns during one of these collection drives. She was publicly denounced during a sermon, and days later her household was attacked by a group of teenage Piagnoni, who poured ink over her wardrobe and broke her mirrors. Her eventual flight from the city underscored the social pressure Savonarola's movement could exert even without formal legal authority. Though he maintained the appearance of humility, Savonarola was keenly aware of his growing power. He began to assert that his visions were not metaphorical, but direct communications with God. He claimed that angels visited him and that he had received divine instructions for guiding Florence. Critics charged him with heresy and megalomania, but his supporters pointed to the apparent fulfillment of his earlier prophecies as proof of divine favor. By 1494, as tensions rose between Florence and the French monarchy, Savonarola's warnings seemed to materialize with eerie precision. The city braced itself for conflict and began to look to the friar not merely as a preacher but as a leader who could interpret and perhaps avert divine judgment. What began as sermons of warning were morphing into blueprints for salvation. And for the first time in its turbulent history, Florence seemed willing to entrust its future not to a prince or banker, but to a man who claimed to speak with God. As the 1490s progressed, Florence hovered on the brink of crisis. The Medici had been expelled, leaving a vacuum of leadership, and Charles VIII of France, having invaded the Italian peninsula, approached the city with a formidable army. The sudden convergence of foreign threat and internal uncertainty gave Savonarola's message an air of uncanny prescience. His earlier prophecies of divine scourges and foreign intervention no longer seemed abstract. Many Florentines, fearing the wrath of both God and the French, turned to the Dominican friar for guidance. He had warned that a new Cyrus would come from the north to punish Italy's corruption. When Charles VIII entered Florence peacefully in November 1494, some believed the prophecy had been fulfilled. Savonarola played a critical role in negotiating Florence's survival. He met with Charles and framed Florence as a chosen city, one destined to lead Italy into spiritual renewal. The French king, having no interest in raising a city of pious reformers, agreed to favorable terms and continued his campaign toward Naples. For many Florentines, Savonarola had not only predicted disaster, but miraculously steered them through it. His popularity soared and his claim to spiritual authority became more difficult to challenge. In the wake of this episode, Florence sought to reorganize itself. Inspired in part by classical Republican ideals, and in part by Savonarola's vision of a Christian commonwealth, the city drafted a new constitution. The Great Council, an expanded and more democratic legislative body, was created to reflect wider civic participation. Though he held no official office, Savonarola became the guiding conscience of the new republic, his voice shaping its laws, values, and rituals. The state began to mirror the pulpit. What distinguished Savonarola's rule from typical clerical influence was the intensity of his moral vision. He did not merely want a stable republic, he demanded a godly one. Florence, he insisted, had been chosen as a new Jerusalem, a beacon of virtue for all Christendom. To fulfill this destiny, the city had to be purged of sin in every form. His sermons became both spiritual diatribes and political directives. Gambling was outlawed, taverns were shuttered, brothels were raided. Theater performances were canceled or rewritten to reflect religious themes. In place of secular festivals, the city held processions of children chanting hymns and carrying relics. The transformation was not just visible, it was auditory. One of the most chilling changes involved the rise of the Compagnacci bands of zealous youths who patrolled the streets to enforce Savonarola's moral mandates. Often adolescents or young men in their 20s, they acted with righteous fury, compelling citizens to confess sins or surrender immoral possessions. These groups were not officially sanctioned but operated with impunity. In one disturbing case, a bookseller who refused to burn his inventory of classical poetry was beaten and had his stall destroyed. His collection, some of it rare, was later thrown into the flames. This fusion of religion surveillance and coercion became institutionalized in the infamous Bonfire of the Vanities, a ritual first conducted in 1497. On the eve of Lent, massive wooden pyramids were erected in Florence's public squares. Citizens, urged by Piagnoni and patrolling youths, contributed vanities to be burned, cosmetics mirrors, secular literature, musical instruments, even paintings. Artists like Botticelli, once a favored painter of the Medici, are believed to have cast some of their own works into the flames, though whether voluntarily or under pressure remains debated. The bonfires became spectacles of mass repentance, but they also bore the hallmarks of psychological terror. Even within the Dominican order, Savonarola's influence sparked unease. Some friars viewed his growing authority and claims of divine communication with suspicion. A few feared he was sliding into heresy, particularly when he insisted that the Holy Spirit spoke directly through him, bypassing the established hierarchy of the Church. His sermons frequently blurred the line between prophecy and policy, as he outlined not only divine will, but specific courses of civic action. The pulpit became a command center. Savonarola's emphasis on visions grew increasingly detailed and theatrical. He claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary, to have conversed with angels, and to have glimpsed the eternal damnation of Florence's enemies. His enemies, both imagined and real, featured heavily in these accounts. He named specific clerics, politicians, and rival orders as agents of Satan. In one homily, he described a demonic council meeting in which devils plotted to destroy Florence unless it remained faithful to his teachings. Such imagery reinforced his authority, but also heightened paranoia. The divisions within Florence became more pronounced. On one side stood the Piagnoni, deeply religious citizens, who saw Savonarola as a prophet, and Florence as a city under divine mission. On the other stood the Arrabbiati, or angry ones, a coalition of secularists, Medici loyalists, skeptical merchants, and libertine humanists who viewed Savonarola as a theocratic tyrant. Tensions between these factions erupted into street violence on more than one occasion. In a particularly gruesome incident, a Piagnoni procession was ambushed, and several children were trampled or injured. One boy, struck by a stone, lost an eye. His injury was later described in sermons as a martyrdom. Amid this growing polarization, Savonarola's language took a darker tone. He no longer spoke merely of Florence's salvation, but of the punishment awaiting those who opposed its destiny. He invoked Old Testament imagery cities consumed by fire leaders, struck down by plagues, and applied it to his enemies. He warned that those who resisted reform would not only perish, but would be remembered as traitors to God's chosen republic. Externally, however, Savonarola's influence was causing ripples well beyond Florence. His denunciations of papal corruption drew increasing attention from Rome. Pope Alexander VI, having initially tolerated the friar's invectives, began to view him as a threat to ecclesiastical authority. Savonarola had condemned simony and nepotism in general terms, but by 1496, he was directly accusing the Pope of moral unfitness. He even rejected multiple invitations to appear before the Curia, citing divine instruction and the Pope's alleged impurity. These acts were not only insubordinate, they bordered on schismatic. Still, Florence remained under his spell. Public processions grew larger, enforcement of morality more stringent, and the belief in the city's divine election more entrenched. But underneath the fervor, pressure was mounting. The Great Council was divided. The economy faltered due to disrupted trade and puritanical reforms, and external enemies, including the Medici in exile, watched closely for an opportunity to strike. Savonarola had raised Florence to a spiritual high, but he had also bound its fate to his own prophetic vision. If his divine mandate were ever questioned, the fall would be swift and unforgiving. By early 1497, Girolamo Savonarola's grip on Florence had reached its zenith. Though he held no official government post, his sermons shaped legislation, his followers monitored public behavior, and his vision of a New Jerusalem guided policy. Florence had become the rarest of political experiments, a republic ruled by a preacher, animated not by party ideology or dynastic ambition, but by a theology of fear purification and divine mission. The centerpiece of Savonarola's moral regime was the bonfire of the vanities, a ritual that transformed the public square into a theater of collective penance. On February 7, 1497, the eve of Ash Wednesday, the largest and most infamous of these bonfires was held. In the Piazza della Signoria, a seven-tiered pyramid of wood, nearly 60 feet high, was constructed with precision and ceremonial gravity. Thousands gathered to watch as luxury items, artworks, musical instruments, and secular books were consumed by fire. The spectacle was not spontaneous. Children known as the Brigate dei Fanciulli, or bands of boys, had spent weeks patrolling homes and businesses, collecting items deemed sinful. Their zeal was neither innocent nor benign. Some of the children had been trained to chant accusatory hymns outside the homes of those reluctant to surrender possessions. If someone refused, the bands would return in greater numbers, sometimes pelting windows with stones or threatening denunciation. In one case, an elderly bookseller who hid a cache of Ovid and Petrarch manuscripts was reported by his own grandson, a devout Piagnone, who later received public praise in a sermon for his courageous love of virtue. The man was publicly shamed and his books destroyed. Afterward, he was said to have stopped speaking altogether, taking his meals in silence and eventually refusing to leave his home. This climate of surveillance and coercion permeated daily life. Marriages were scrutinized for signs of ostentation. Women who wore silk or used perfume were harassed in the streets. Tavern owners faced ruin as alcohol sales plummeted under new restrictions. Artists and musicians either adapted their work to reflect religious themes or ceased working altogether. A few left the city. Botticelli, once celebrated for his mythological paintings, is believed to have withdrawn from public commissions during this time. Though documentation is sparse, accounts suggest that some of his works were indeed consigned to the flames, if not by him, then by disciples under pressure. Savonarola insisted that these measures were not punitive but redemptive. Florence, he preached, was undergoing a cleansing, a necessary trial before its elevation as the model of Christian virtue. The hardships were a test of the city's resolve, and resistance was nothing less than rebellion against divine will. Yet the psychological toll of this purification campaign was unmistakable. Public life grew quieter, more restrained. Cultural spaces closed. Citizens measured their words, fearful of denunciation. For many, the once vibrant city began to resemble a monastery under siege. Yet beneath this conformity, dissent simmered. The Arrabbiati, composed of Medician loyalists, disaffected elites, and anti-clerical Republicans, began organizing in opposition. They resented Savonarola's theocratic control and lamented the economic stagnation caused by his moral regulations. Merchants complained of lost revenues. Foreign investors withdrew. Even allies began to grumble. More troubling for Savonarola, some members of the Great Council, once swayed by his vision, grew wary of his influence and concerned by his increasing defiance of papal authority. The Vatican, meanwhile, had reached its breaking point. Pope Alexander VI, long scandalized by Savonarola's public denunciations, now sought to silence him. A first warning in 1495 had been ignored. In June 1497, after continued refusal to appear in Rome and repeated accusations against the papal court, the Pope issued a formal excommunication. The charge was not mere heresy, but schism, a direct threat to the unity of the Church. Savonarola refused to acknowledge the sentence. He argued that a corrupt pope had no authority to excommunicate a true servant of God. From the pulpit, he proclaimed that his obedience was owed to Christ alone, not to a pontiff mired in sin. He continued to preach, celebrate Mass, and exercise influence as if the ban carried no weight. But for many Florentines, this marked a troubling shift. Even some of his supporters began to question whether his spiritual mission was crossing into delusion. The timing of the excommunication could not have been more destabilizing. Florence was already under pressure from external powers. The Medici, exiled but not forgotten, were lobbying foreign allies to support their return. Pope Alexander, too, urged Florence to suppress Savonarola or face papal interdict, a punishment that would isolate the city from the Church, suspend sacraments, and cripple both spiritual life and trade. Caught between a prophet and a pontiff, the Republic wavered. To reaffirm his moral and political supremacy, Savonarola intensified his campaign. His sermons took on a more violent tone, filled with imagery of divine retribution and fiery cleansing. He invoked Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Revelation, painting Florence as a city on the cusp of salvation or destruction. He warned of plague invasion and damnation if the city turned from its righteous path. His enemies, he claimed, were not merely political rivals, but instruments of the devil. One particularly chilling sermon included a vision he claimed to have received in prayer. He described Florence as a woman standing atop a tower, clothed in white but surrounded by snakes. One snake bit her foot, causing her to fall. As she fell, the city burst into flames and corpses filled the streets. Savonarola interpreted this as a sign if Florence allowed sin and doubt to creep back, and God would no longer shield it. In the face of growing resistance, Savonarola's supporters became more aggressive. The Brigate dei Fanciulli expanded their patrols, and public acts of penance became more elaborate. Some penitents walked barefoot through the streets, lashing themselves with ropes. At one procession, a woman reportedly collapsed after attempting to carry a heavy wooden cross for over an hour. Though visibly bleeding, she was applauded as a martyr. Savonarola praised such acts as proof of Florence's spiritual fortitude. But these displays increasingly appeared fanatical to outsiders, and even to some within. Foreign ambassadors began describing Florence not as a republic, but as a cult. Venetian and Milanese envoys mocked the city's moral rigidity and religious excess. Even moderate clergy within Florence grew concerned that Savonarola's defiance of Rome could provoke divine punishment rather than avert it. For a city that had once basked in humanist confidence, Florence now looked deeply unsettled, its identity torn between Renaissance legacy and apocalyptic destiny. Savonarola, however, remained resolute. He believed the trials were confirmation of his divine mission. Persecution, after all, was the mark of true prophecy. But as the excommunication took hold, alliances frayed and patience wore thin. The bonfires had consumed the vanities of Florence, but they had also consumed its tolerance. The people had followed Savonarola through fire. Now many were beginning to wonder where that fire would stop. By late 1497, cracks in the once solid edifice of Savonarola's moral republic began to widen. The same mechanisms that had elevated him public enthusiasm, the fluid power vacuum left by the Medici and the resonance of apocalyptic rhetoric, now worked in reverse. The spiritual fervor he had so effectively weaponized began to turn cold, then hostile, as Florentines grew weary of fear, economic stagnation, and increasing isolation from the Catholic world. A city that had once embraced its prophet was beginning to question whether it had merely traded one tyranny for another. The most immediate threat came not from foreign invasion or papal edict, but from internal opposition. The Arrabbiati, previously disorganized and marginal, had gained momentum throughout 1497. They capitalized on discontent among merchants' guild members and moderate Republicans who had supported the new constitution, but not the religious purges that followed. These opponents were no longer content to criticize in private. They began organizing within the Great Council, challenging Savonarola's allies in debates and quietly restoring networks of Medici sympathizers. In whispers, the word conspiracy returned to Florentine politics. Their timing was opportune. The excommunication issued by Pope Alexander VI had begun to take tangible effect. Though Savonarola dismissed it as illegitimate, it carried real consequences. Other Dominican houses began to distance themselves from San Marco, and clergy in surrounding regions declined to recognize the sacraments performed under Savonarola's guidance. More troubling still, ambassadors from Venice and Milan began advising Florence's leaders to sever ties with the friar or risk papal retaliation, including economic sanctions and the dreaded interdict, a move that would effectively shut down the church's operations in the city, barring baptisms, marriages, and even burials. To navigate this rising tide of opposition, Savonarola doubled down. In his sermons, he painted the conflict not as a political dispute, but as a spiritual war. Those who opposed him, he thundered, were not merely misguided, they were doing Satan's bidding. He denounced members of the Signoria by name, accusing them of treachery and spiritual cowardice. His tone, once urgent but conciliatory, now carried the unmistakable edge of desperation. He no longer urged reform, he demanded submission. The civic leadership of Florence, caught between papal threats and domestic instability, grew increasingly alarmed. A faction of the Signoria began drafting legislation to curtail Savonarola's influence. They sought to limit his access to the pulpit, regulate the activities of the Brigate dei Fanciulli, and restore religious moderation to public life. In response, Savonarola delivered a sermon laced with thinly veiled threats. He invoked the story of Korah's rebellion from the Book of Numbers, in which those who challenged the authority of God's chosen were swallowed by the earth. The message was not subtle. Meanwhile, the Vatican was preparing a more concrete response. In early 1498, Alexander VI dispatched a new envoy to Florence with a clear demand: silence Savonarola or face ecclesiastical and political consequences. The Pope also wrote to the Dominicans, directly threatening to dissolve the Florentine convent if it continued to shield the friar. These efforts were accompanied by increasingly aggressive diplomacy. Rome was building pressure not only from within, but from all sides. Among the most insidious threats were the return efforts by the Medici. Though still in exile, they maintained influence through sympathetic nobles, strategic marriages, and clandestine agents operating in Florence. Letters from this period reveal that Piero de' Medici's supporters were actively courting the disillusioned, portraying a restored Medici rule as a return to prosperity and stability. For many Florentines, this was becoming a persuasive argument. Yet Savonarola did not retreat. He held a public disputation against a group of Franciscan critics, denouncing them as enemies of divine truth. In one especially bitter exchange, a Franciscan accused him of setting himself above the church. Savonarola replied that the Pope himself was a broken reed, and that any man, even a pontiff, who rejected God's law was no better than the Antichrist. These confrontations, once exciting to his followers, now drew nervous glances. What had once seemed righteous indignation now carried the weight of potential blasphemy. Perhaps the most telling sign of his waning influence was the changing response of the crowds. Once rapt and tearful congregants now listened in silence or with guarded expressions. The processions grew smaller. Confiscations of vanities met with quiet resistance. In March 1498, a bookseller named Matteo di Benci refused to surrender his stock to the Piagnoni youth patrols. When confronted, he brandished a knife and declared, "I would sooner burn your prophet than my books." The patrols withdrew, and the story circulated as a sign that fear of Savonarola was fading. The final blow would come not from a foreign army or papal decree, but from within Florence itself. A group of Franciscans, emboldened by papal support and public mood, issued a direct challenge. They proposed an ordeal by fire, a medieval test of divine favor. A representative of the Franciscans would walk through flames alongside a Dominican, each invoking God's protection. Whichever man emerged unharmed would be confirmed as speaking the truth. The proposal was theatrical, archaic, and legally dubious, but it caught the imagination of the city. Savonarola initially hesitated, aware of the spectacle's dangers. Yet pressure from his supporters and perhaps his own belief in divine vindication forced his hand. He accepted the challenge. The chosen champion on his side would be Fra Domenico da Pescia, a loyal Piagnone and gifted orator. The date was set for April 7, 1498, in the Piazza della Signoria. Preparations began immediately. Wooden platforms were constructed, tensions mounted, crowds gathered from surrounding towns. On the day of the event, tens of thousands filled the square. The scene was surreal, two pyres, a gauntlet of flame, and an eerie silence as the representatives of both sides stood ready. But a dispute over the rules, specifically whether Fra Domenico could carry a crucifix or relic, delayed the ordeal. Hours passed. The crowd grew restless. Finally, the Signoria canceled the event, citing weather and procedural uncertainty. The cancellation was a catastrophe. The people, many of whom had come expecting divine spectacle, turned angry. Rumors spread that Savonarola had lost his nerve, that he had manipulated God's will to suit his fears. The Franciscan opponent, by contrast, left the square to cheers. It no longer mattered that Savonarola had not walked into the flames. In the court of public opinion, he had fled from judgment. That evening, Florentines gathered not for a sermon, but to burn effigies of the friar. Chants once reserved for hymns were replaced by mockery. The moral authority Savonarola had painstakingly built sermon by sermon had evaporated in a single afternoon. His enemies moved swiftly. Within days, the Signoria voted to arrest him. The city that once treated his word as law now demanded his silence. The aftermath of the failed ordeal by fire left Florence disillusioned, fractured, and volatile. Girolamo Savonarola, once seen as the moral compass of a reborn republic, had now become its chief liability. The very mechanisms he had helped build popular moralism, spiritual fervor, and civic unity had turned against him. The perception that he had shirked a divine trial eroded what remained of his legitimacy, and within days of the debacle, a city once dominated by his voice turned sharply toward vengeance. On April 8, 1498, a mob gathered outside the convent of San Marco. Their chants called for justice, retribution, and the dissolution of Savonarola's corrupting influence. Though the friars attempted to barricade the doors, the Signoria, seizing the moment, ordered the arrest of Savonarola and his two closest followers, Fra Domenico da Pescia and Fra Silvestro Maruffi. A detachment of armed guards stormed the convent, clashing with loyal Piagnoni who tried to resist. The fighting, though brief, left several wounded. According to a later report, one friar was found unconscious in the sacristy, his head split open by a cobblestone. Savonarola was taken into custody and imprisoned in the Piazza della Signoria, where his fate would be decided not through debate or theological argument, but through instruments of torture and political maneuvering. In the grand tradition of Florentine trials, confessions were expected, and the methods used to procure them were considered both justified and routine. The interrogations began immediately. Savonarola was subjected to the strappado, a brutal method in which the accused was suspended by the wrists tied behind the back and then dropped from a height, wrenching the shoulders from their sockets. He screamed under the pain, and the notaries recorded his utterances, many of them incoherent or contradictory. In his first confession, he admitted to fabricating some of his prophecies and exaggerated his role as God's messenger. But days later, when the pain had subsided, he retracted most of those admissions, claiming they had been forced from him under duress. This cycle repeated multiple times: torture, confession, recantation. The documents from these sessions reveal a man unraveling. Though he occasionally displayed moments of lucidity, citing scripture, explaining his vision for Florence, and reaffirming his belief in divine justice, he also broke down weeping, accusing himself of pride and misleading the people. The once unshakable prophet now appeared exhausted both physically and spiritually. His interrogators, eager to extract politically useful statements, pushed harder. His fellow friars fared little better. Fra Silvestro confessed quickly, perhaps, in a desperate attempt to save himself. Fra Domenico, by contrast, remained steadfast, declaring even under torture that Savonarola had been chosen by God. His unwavering loyalty earned him admiration among the remaining Piagnoni, but sealed his fate in the eyes of the authorities. For the regime to fully purge itself of Savonarolan influence, his inner circle had to fall with him. Despite the excommunication issued by Alexander VI, the Pope saw political advantage in handling Savonarola's punishment carefully. Rome had no desire to create a martyr, especially not one who could potentially galvanize wider reformist sentiment. So a compromise was arranged. The Florentine government would handle the interrogation and sentencing, but would do so in cooperation with a special papal commission, ensuring that the process appeared both local and ecclesiastically sanctioned. To the public, however, the trial was already decided. Savonarola had betrayed Florence, misled its people, and defied the church. The mood in the city had grown vengeful. At night, songs mocking the friar echoed through the streets. Children once organized into moral patrols now threw stones at the walls of San Marco. One account describes a Piagnoni widow who was dragged from her home and publicly humiliated for defending Savonarola. She was forced to kneel in the street while citizens spit on her and tore her veil. When questioned later, she refused to denounce him, saying only, "He gave me hope." The Signoria, now dominated by Arrabbiati elements and under pressure from the papacy, began preparing for execution. The charges were clear heresy, sedition, and false prophecy. Though some officials expressed concern about the legitimacy of a confession obtained under torture, their objections were dismissed. Florence, after all, had no tradition of leniency in matters of civic betrayal. The same city that had executed political enemies under the Medici and exiled entire families now sought to cleanse itself of its theocratic experiment. But before sentencing, the commission conducted one final damning evaluation. They requested Savonarola to compose a written confession. Deprived of his pulpit and physically broken, he produced a document that blended remorse, self-justification, and resignation. He admitted that his prophecies might have been flawed, but insisted that his intentions were pure. He argued that Florence had needed moral reform, and that if his methods had been harsh, it was only because the sins of the city were so deeply rooted. He denied acting out of ambition. He concluded the text with a passage from Psalm 51, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." The confession was not published widely, but circulated among the elite. Some saw in it evidence of a broken man, others a final manipulation. Either way, it had no bearing on the outcome. On May 22, 1498, the Signoria formally sentenced Girolamo Savonarola, Fra Domenico, and Fra Silvestro to death. The method would be hanging, followed by burning. It was a symbolic inversion of his reign, no bonfire of vanities this time, but of bodies. That evening, the condemned men were transferred to a holding cell beneath the Palazzo Vecchio adjacent to the execution site. Eyewitnesses reported that Savonarola spent the night in prayer, though he slept little. A Dominican friar was allowed to visit him, offering final confession and last rites. He reportedly declined to retract his sermons, but accepted the church's judgment, stating, "I am dust, and to dust I shall return." Fra Domenico, ever the loyal disciple, asked only that they die together. Outside the city prepared for the spectacle. The Piazza della Signoria, once the site of triumphant processions and civic reforms, would now host a very different kind of ritual. Workers assembled a tall wooden platform with 3 gallows arranged in a row. Beneath them, a massive pyre was prepared. The symbolism was unmistakable execution, not just as punishment, but as purification. The shift in public sentiment was now absolute. Florence was no longer the city of penance, but of penance denied. The man who had claimed to save it had instead brought it to the brink of war, economic ruin, and spiritual confusion. His fall was not just political, it was theological. By rejecting the church, Savonarola had removed the one structure that could have defended him. Now, with both civic and papal power aligned against him, his fate was sealed. At dawn on May 23, 1498, the bells of Florence rang out not for mass but for execution. In the Piazza della Signoria, a large crowd gathered in uneasy silence. Markets were shuttered, windows thrown open. Every balcony and rooftop in sight was filled with Florentines drawn to witness the final act in the public life of Girolamo Savonarola. Soldiers cordoned off the square and clerks moved through the crowd, reminding onlookers that blasphemy or disruption would not be tolerated. The atmosphere was reverent and morbid, charged by a collective sense that something more than justice was unfolding, something closer to ritual sacrifice. A wooden platform had been erected beside the Palazzo Vecchio. 3 gallows stood in a line atop it, their nooses already knotted. Below them, a mound of dry wood brush and pitch had been arranged for immediate ignition. The symbolism was deliberate hanging would silence the body. Fire would erase the legacy. The intention was not merely to kill, but to obliterate. The condemned men Savonarola, Fra Domenico, and Fra Silvestro were brought out under armed guard. Each wore the white Dominican habit, but the fabric was stained and torn from weeks in confinement. Their hands were bound and their faces pale from torture and sleeplessness. Fra Silvestro, who had broken under interrogation, looked hollow-eyed and distant. Fra Domenico, ever composed, walked with upright posture and sang quietly. Savonarola moved slowly, head bowed, eyes fixed on the gallows. Witnesses described his demeanor as resigned, not broken. Before the execution could proceed, a clerical ceremony was required. Because the men were priests, they first had to be stripped of their holy status. A papal delegation had traveled from Rome to perform the defrocking. Before the eyes of the crowd, each friar was ritually degraded, their vestments were removed, their hands smeared with oil, then scrubbed with vinegar to signify the removal of sacred power. As Savonarola was stripped of his priesthood, the officiating prelate declared, "We separate you from the church militant and triumphant." Savonarola replied softly, "Not from the church triumphant, for that is not yours to do." The ceremony took over an hour. During that time, the crowd grew restless. Some shouted for the flames to be lit immediately. Others wept silently. A few hecklers hurled curses calling Savonarola a false prophet and an enemy of Christ. Notably, several former Piagnoni were seen among them, disillusioned followers who had turned now eager to prove their loyalty to the restored status quo. At mid-morning, the execution began. The 3 friars were led to the gallows. Each noose was fastened quickly. Fra Silvestro was hanged first. His body twitched for a moment, then fell still. Fra Domenico came next, reportedly praying aloud until the rope tightened. Last came Savonarola. As he was raised, a hush fell over the crowd. Some witnesses said he tried to speak, but no words came. Others claimed his lips moved silently in prayer. Within moments, all 3 bodies hung lifeless above the woodpile. Then came the fire. Torches were thrown into the base of the pyre, which ignited rapidly. The flames climbed until they consumed the platform, reaching the suspended corpses. A thick column of black smoke rose above the square. Flesh crackled, robes, shriveled bones split under the heat. The smell, sweet, oily, and unmistakable, drifted over the crowd. Some turned away in nausea. Others stood fixed as if witnessing a necessary cleansing. The Signoria had ordered that nothing remain. Once the bodies were burned to ash, workers stirred the embers to ensure complete incineration. The few nails and bone fragments that survived were collected and dumped into the Arno River. The goal was erasure, no relics, no tombs, no martyrdom. Even the ashes were to be denied memory. But the effort to destroy Savonarola's legacy so thoroughly had the opposite effect. Almost immediately, accounts of the execution began circulating. Some described miracles. One said a dove flew through the smoke. Another claimed the ropes burned away before the flames touched the friars. Though these reports were dismissed by authorities, they found eager audiences among those still sympathetic to Savonarola. Secret prayers were said at the site of the execution. Pilgrims began visiting the remains of San Marco. By attempting to erase him, the regime had inadvertently sanctified him in the minds of his remaining followers. The Signoria, now rid of its most divisive figure, turned quickly to the business of consolidating power. Laws passed during Savonarola's rule were quietly repealed. Taverns reopened, musical performances resumed, and the Brigate dei Fanciulli disappeared from the streets. Artists returned to secular themes, and merchants resumed trade in goods once considered sinful. The Medici remained in exile, but the vision of Florence as a theocratic republic was definitively over. Despite the speed of Florence's return to normalcy, the psychological trauma of Savonarola's reign lingered. Many citizens carried the guilt of having supported him, only to watch him perish in disgrace. Families once bound together in spiritual community now found themselves divided by recriminations and silence. One diarist, writing weeks after the execution, noted that even the air smells different, now less holy but less heavy. It was as if a burden had been lifted, but at an unbearable cost. Among Savonarola's surviving disciples, grief blended with confusion. Some fled the city. Others retreated into monastic silence. A few began compiling his sermons and writings, preserving what they could before further repression took hold. In these circles, a counter-narrative began to take root. Savonarola had not been a failed prophet, but a martyr, sacrificed by a corrupt church and a cowardly city. His death, rather than ending his influence, ensured it would persist quietly, subversively, and eventually powerfully. Even within the Dominican order, debates erupted. Was Savonarola a visionary or a heretic? A reformer ahead of his time, or a demagogue who mistook passion for prophecy? These questions would follow the order and Florence for centuries. For now, the fire had gone out. The ashes had been swept into the river. And yet as the waters of the Arno carried them away, they left behind a city forever marked not only by what Savonarola had done, but by what it had allowed itself to become under him. In the days following the execution, Florence entered a period of uneasy quiet. The Piazza della Signoria so recently, the stage of mass repentance and collective fervor, now stood as a site of spectral absence. The platform was dismantled. Ashes were washed away. But the memory of Savonarola's rise and fall could not be so easily erased. His moral vision had shaped the city's institutions, its laws, and its public rituals. His downfall left not just a leadership vacuum, but a spiritual one too. The Signoria, eager to prevent any resurgence of Piagnoni influence, moved swiftly to neutralize Savonarola's legacy. His writings were banned, his sermons suppressed, and the Dominican convent of San Marco was placed under scrutiny. A few friars were reassigned, others were monitored closely. Public references to Savonarola were discouraged. In sermons and civic proclamations, officials emphasized obedience to Rome and loyalty to the restored secular order. And yet in private, his memory lingered. Hidden within cellars, convents, and private homes, his supporters preserved manuscripts, copied sermons by hand, and recited prayers once spoken in his voice. Even as official Florence turned its back on the friar, it had once followed with religious zeal underground devotion coalesced. To these clandestine adherents, Savonarola had not died in shame, but in fulfillment of divine prophecy. His suffering, like that of Christ, had exposed the corruption of worldly powers. This belief was not merely devotional, it had political resonance. Florence's disenchantment with its post-Savonarolan leadership grew in the early years of the 16th century. The city's republic, though purged of moral extremism, remained unstable. Factions vied for control. The Medici, though still in exile, gained sympathy among certain elites, while others continued to fear their return. In this volatile climate, Savonarola's name became both a warning and a weapon used by radicals and reformers alike to criticize excess or moral decay. Among the most significant long-term effects of Savonarola's legacy was its influence on religious reform beyond Florence. Though condemned by the papacy, his writings, especially on ecclesiastical corruption and the need for spiritual renewal, were read by reformers across Europe. His ideas would later find echoes in the voices of Martin Luther and other Protestant thinkers. Indeed, Luther himself would cite Savonarola as a martyr of the true faith, despite theological differences. Yet within Florence, the most intense legacy was psychological. For a city that prided itself on liberty culture and civic pride, Savonarola had forced a reckoning. He had shown how easily public enthusiasm could be manipulated, how fear could masquerade as faith, and how the pursuit of purity could end in violence. The very structures that enabled Renaissance glory rhetoric image performance had also enabled a theocratic regime. This trauma manifested in subtle but enduring ways. Artworks once aligned with Savonarola's values were repainted or hidden. Civic holidays associated with his reforms quietly disappeared from the calendar. Children who had marched in his processions grew into adults who seldom spoke of that time. A few years after the execution, a young Florentine chronicler wrote, "We pretended it was all a dream. But when we walked past San Marco, we walked faster." One particularly disturbing development occurred in the early 1500s, when rumors emerged that a child had been born with a birthmark resembling a Dominican cross. In nearby Prato, it was said that a weeping statue of the Virgin cried not tears but soot. Though dismissed by authorities as superstition, these stories reflect how deeply Savonarola's memory had embedded itself in the city's subconscious. The fear he once harnessed now took root in folklore. Attempts to canonize Savonarola began as early as the mid-1500s. Supporters argued that he had died in defense of Christian morality, not in opposition to the Church. They pointed to his fasting, his visions, and his unwavering refusal to recant under pressure. But opposition remained strong, particularly from within the Curia, which viewed his defiance of papal authority as an unpardonable breach. The question of sainthood would remain unresolved for centuries, revisited sporadically but never concluded. Yet perhaps the most enduring paradox of Savonarola's legacy was this. Though he had sought to purify Florence by fire, it was the city's memory of that fire, its rituals, its excesses, its destruction, that left the deepest impression. He had tried to erase sin by obliterating symbols, but in doing so, had created new symbols, ones that haunted the city long after he was gone. By the mid-16th century, Florence had changed. The Medici returned to power first informally, then formally transforming the Republic into a ducal state. Political expression narrowed. Civic religion gave way to courtly ceremony. But beneath the surface, the memory of a monk who once ruled the city by the force of his voice endured a cautionary tale of how faith can become fanaticism, and how a city's desire for redemption can consume its freedom. The execution of Girolamo Savonarola marked not just the end of a man, but the climax of a profound spiritual and political crisis in Renaissance Florence. His rise fueled by popular unrest and moral fervor, and his fall orchestrated by a convergence of papal authority and public disillusionment, revealed the fragile interplay between religion and politics in an era of profound transformation. In the long view of history, Savonarola remains a deeply polarizing figure. To some, he was a visionary who foresaw the moral decay of the Church decades before the Reformation. To others, he was a zealot who stifled art joy and freedom under the pretense of divine mandate. His theocratic regime briefly transformed one of Europe's most cosmopolitan cities into a puritanical experiment proof of how quickly liberty can collapse under the weight of ideology. Yet his impact extended far beyond Florence. His denunciations of church corruption resonated in reformist circles throughout Europe. His critiques of clerical vice, the commodification of salvation, and the moral complacency of the elite were echoed in the writings of figures from Erasmus to Luther. Though he remained loyal to Catholic doctrine, his challenge to papal authority anticipated the more radical ruptures of the Protestant Reformation. Ironically, the church that condemned him would later confront many of the same charges he leveled in his sermons. Savonarola's ashes were meant to vanish in the Arno, but his memory did not. Florence would never fully erase his presence. His legacy endured in suppressed manuscripts, whispered prayers, and the silent guilt of a city that once called him prophet, then called him traitor. He was in the end both a product of his time and a force that helped shape it, a man consumed by fire whose life and death continue to illuminate the volatile power of belief.